Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on set live is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Usually terrific.
Great. Today we are going to be talking about the World Cup and how fun it's been so far.
Very, very interesting.
A warm welcome to you, all our Facebook followers are watching us from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka, ask some really interesting questions. Shaka, let's get to it. Let's start with the World Cup. So many teams have played, and so far it looks like about 6 countries have made it to the quarterfinals. Actually, 8 countries have made it to the quarterfinals. Let's break it down. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I really have to apologize to the audience because I did seriously think that Africa, the African continent, I'm not talking about the African diaspora, because the African diaspora is still in business via Brazil, via France, via England, via Belgium, and what have you. So the Africans are still represented. But the African continent itself, really, we had 5 countries to begin with. We do not have any single country in the second round. And in fact, Senegal, I had thought sincerely that it had booked a seat, at least in the second round. And it really quite did, really, especially because you recall that they ended up actually on the same page with Japan. Unfortunately for Senegal, even though they had the same statistics, there was one thing that they were not doing well in, and this was the issue of discipline. They had actually earned slightly more yellow cards and all that kind of stuff, and that's the reason, frankly, why we are not seeing them in the second round.
So it was a technical knockout?
It was a technical knockout, but the guys, you know, gave it they gave it their all. But I think Africa really has to do something. And I think it can still do it. Because let's face it, when I was a kid, Paul, it was very difficult to think about an African champion when it came to global competition and what have you. And there are times when, I remember when I was at Kigezi High School primary, and I came across a magazine of the Commonwealth Games. And I saw a black man called Eddie Bray from Ghana, who was a Commonwealth champion in boxing. And I saw Dick Tiger from Nigeria, who had become a world champion in boxing, who had beaten people we called Muzungu, the white man. And I would see great sprinters from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, you know, that kind of stuff. And I would say, oh my God. And I would think these were, you know, my relatives. But Chiga, because my worldview was limited, frankly, to Kabale. But I thought I was represented. But I think I was right, because when you look at it in the context of history, I was. And that's why we are talking about our cultural cousins, the African diaspora. 1998, they actually won it for France. Without them, France would never have a claim on the world championship. Zidane.
Yeah, that famous player.
Yeah, he scored, of course, 2 goals, and of course, he traces his ancestry in Algeria.
Interesting. Let's go to a Twitter. There's a Twitter here from Katiti Wali Kanua. Why should Africa continue to play the World Cup in which it's predetermined against them?
Well, I don't know what Katiti means by in which it is predetermined against them. Is he talking perhaps about refereeing? There are people who have been complaining about refereeing, that the referees, frankly, don't seem to be neutral, so to speak. And of course, to some extent, they may be right, because even in the Olympics, that issue has been raised, and there is some evidence. But in this particular case, I don't honestly think that it is the issue of refereeing. I don't think that it is the issue of Africa probably being at a great disadvantage, because we do have some great African footballers who are playing in some of the most, some of the top leagues around the world. These guys are as good as anybody. I think the only problem, frankly, that I see with the Africans is one, the administration, the organization factor. There are situations where footballers are not treated, frankly, nicely, motivated, so that they can feel patriotic and feel that they are really passionate about what they are doing. Because to win, this requires a team effort. There might be some individual stars and what have you, and they are there. There's no question about it. But in order for you to win and score the goals and what have you, you need team effort. And in order for you to have team effort, you need to have very good coaches. You need to have very good managers and all that kind of stuff. And also, the individual players have to be physically, mentally, psychologically very, very strong.
Shaka, you make a great point, and I wanted to follow up on it. I think, should we blame the governments for failing, for example, to maybe invest more money in training? Because football or soccer is the #1 sport on the continent. Every single kid plays soccer. Whether you like it or not, you have to play soccer. So I don't see why we are not competitive when it comes to these world champions. We play in these major leagues, yes. For example, a team like France right now that is still playing in the World Cup, pretty much every single one of the players is from Africa or has his ancestry in Africa. But when it comes to certain things, we are missing in action.
I don't think that it is limited to football, really. I think you can look at it in so many different other aspects of life. First of all, I think it is the issue of governance, sincerely. We do not have many countries on the continent so far. First of all, that really respect, for example, their citizens, their people, in a sense that they value them, they put value on them. In fact, I remember when I was growing up, when you were very good in playing football, in running around the field, which is athletics and what have you, people would actually be laughing at you that you are wasting time, that you are doing things that are very useless. All you have to do is hit the books, sit for the exams and pass the exams and just move on. That's part of the problem. We have to transcend this attitude of thinking that the only person who is gifted with intelligence or knowledge is someone who can actually sit in a classroom situation of a Western type of, a Western model of education. You read a book, they ask you questions, you answer those questions, and you get a first grade. And you go on like that. There are a lot of other important things, really, besides sitting for an exam and passing it. Look at a man like Pele, for example. He is an institution. This guy never went to school, so to speak, really, if you seriously looked at him. But this guy is very comfortable as an international star, very highly respected, very disciplined. In his times, he was a megastar. In fact, he left some of the records that have not been broken. But wherever he goes, he's somebody. In his own country at one time, he even had the opportunity of being a cabinet minister.
For sports and culture.
Precisely. You don't expect that kind of thing to happen in your country, where you come from.
But wait a minute. We just elected a president in Liberia who was an international superstar.
You are very right.
President George Weah.
I said your country, which is Uganda. The last time I checked, you do not come from Liberia. Okay. But you have a point, obviously. The fact that a country in Africa can elect a former international megastar in terms of football, like George Weah, it means we are making some progress.
Let's cross over to Uganda now. Let's talk a little bit about politics. So in Uganda, the government decided to impose a tax on social media, a tax on mobile money transfers, whether you are sending money or receiving money. And there is a lot of outrage. People are outraged. Every single person I've talked to in the last couple of days, since July 1st, they are outraged. Maybe let's start with a question from Agaba Festus in Uganda. What do you make of this social media tax, Shaka?
Obviously, when you look at Uganda, first of all, you have to look at the political system sincerely. Uganda, as far as I'm concerned, and a lot of observers will tell you, is democratically challenged. And if you are democratically challenged, you do not respect some fundamental rights, which, among other things, we're talking about freedom of expression, because this is one of the fundamental rights in a democracy. And freedom of expression is something, by the way, if you go into any country, including a dictatorship, when you go to the rural area, you find that people are expressing themselves very freely. Or it comes to places where the government is in control, and the government happens not to do good things, it does not want or does not listen to criticism, especially if that type of criticism is not particularly supportive of what they are doing. You're talking about a country in Uganda where one senior cabinet minister, Paul, told me one time, when I asked him about whether he had political ambitions, and did he think at some point to be a president, for example, and he said, wait a minute, Shaka, how can you possibly ask me such a question? I said, what are you talking about? You're supposed to be a democracy in progress. He said, you know what, in Uganda, my friend, you do not even have the right even to have an appetite of that particular position, nor do you have the right even to own an opinion, especially if that particular opinion is not supportive of the status quo. So these are some of the issues that we are facing. Now, when you talk about social media, this is one avenue through which people are free to express themselves. And when they express themselves, sometimes those expressions are reflections of certain opinions that do not sit well or comfortable with the powers that be. But on the other hand, the government has a very interesting argument. It says it is in fact looking for money to pour into service delivery. And you know the service delivery situation in Uganda. You know that when it comes to hospitals, sometimes people will tell you that if you're going to a hospital, it's like you're going to a mortuary, really. So the argument is good, but do they in fact mean it? I don't know, because let's face it, you also have the issue of massive corruption in Uganda. Even though, you know, the leaders talk about, you know, the fighting corruption and what have you. Yes, they talk the talk, but have they been in fact able to walk the talk so as to make sure that they can actually root out corruption? No. But you know, someone said, a fish actually rots from the head.
Shaka, one fierce critic in Uganda by the names of Tom Victor Okwaringa has been a bigger social media critic for the regime and for President Museveni and his people. He says the tax barrier, this tax imposed on social media, is a way to curtail or to prevent people from expressing themselves. That initially the target was to target him as an individual, but this has been extended to affect all the other people. Would you agree with his kind of take on this social media tax?
And why wouldn't I agree? After all, what you just said, almost in fact, what you just said that he says almost suddenly reflects what I was talking about. It is the issue of making sure that Ugandans do not have the right to express themselves. It is an effort, obviously, of making sure that they don't give an opportunity for people to be critical of some of their policies and all that kind of stuff. It means the government obviously is very nervous. It probably is not doing well on the ground, especially when you look at the security issue. You have many women, for example, have been kidnapped, are being killed in the, in the areas surrounding the city, in Entebbe and what have you. And nobody has actually been arrested and taken to courts, and nobody has actually been convicted of this kind of, these types of crimes. And these have included even some very, very important players. You're talking about a former, I think, deputy chief prosecutor who was gunned during the daylight sometime last year, I think, or something like that, and nobody knows who killed that person. You're talking about a situation where the number 3 in the pecking order of the Uganda police force, a man who was an assistant inspector general of police, Mr. Kawesa, he was killed during 9 a.m. East African Standard Time. And up to now, we don't even know who killed that person. I mean, if number 3 person really in the Uganda police can be killed at such a time during daylight, then what about very ordinary Ugandans? People are probably killed every day, but nobody even talks about them because they're not important.
Let's go to another Facebook commenter from Rashid Henry. Formerly, my question is on taxes. They have put on social media $200 a day, rather 200 shillings a day is a lot of money for a lot of people who are unemployed. Uganda has one of the highest unemployed youth.
And the tax regimes,
yes,
by the way.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you have this tax that is imposed on every day. Every time you pick up a phone, every day you charge 200 shillings. That's a lot of money for a lot of people who don't even have jobs.
I know what you're talking about, and I think that, to be very honest with you, in fairness to the government, if it was in fact imposing those type of taxes on people, so that those taxes eventually would perhaps translate into service delivery, like healthcare, like quality education, those types of services, like roads and you name it, and those types of things, nobody would probably be complaining a lot, because the last time I checked, to be honest with you, some of the most highly taxed people live in the Scandinavian countries. We're talking about Denmark, we're talking about Sweden, we're talking about Norway, we're talking about, Finland and what have you. But you know what? Nobody probably complains, to tell you the truth, because those taxes reflect into the real deal. These are some of the most developed countries in the world, at least according to the UN Human Development Index. These are always constantly in the top 5 in terms of quality of life and what have you. They have excellent medical care for everybody, by the way. They have great schools for everybody. They have decent housing and what have you. And so they have something that I often allude to. They have, in fact, social, economic justice for all their citizens. But when you talk about Uganda, you have a problem. Some people, in fact, think some of these taxes are imposed because the people who are in power are looking for a way to, again, enrich themselves, because the last time I checked, a lot of people think that the people who run the store in Uganda and in a lot of African countries are not patriotic sincerely to their countries, that they are patriotic to their stomachs, the stomachs of their families and friends, not society.
You are watching Shaka Extra Time. Today we are talking about a lot of things. Right now, maybe let's talk about South Sudan. South Sudan, the president just announced, through his party, just announced that he wants an extension. We've been talking about these term limits, term extensions. Now South Sudan is the new kid on the block. They want President Salva Kiir's term to be extended. But they recently had, last week, as a matter of fact, they had peace talks in Sudan, talking about how to bring peace in South Sudan. Now, how does this play out?
Well, first of all, I don't think that this helps to build the type of confidence, frankly, that is needed between the government and the opposition, so that they can actually end up really cutting a peace deal. In fact, what he just did probably reflects something that someone said at one time, that when sometimes you look at two people trying to cut a deal or negotiating a peace deal and what have you, it sort of reminds him of a couple who are planning a marriage, but mainly, really, focusing on divorce. Because let's face it, yes, they did meet in the Sudanese capital of Khartoum. They did sign, they ink some pieces of paper and what have you. And as we talk right now, I have information to suggest that they are, in fact, the two parties are in Khartoum negotiating and what have you, especially about these issues that, are related to the peace and all that kind of stuff. And then after that, they're supposed to go to the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, where they will be talking about power sharing. For the most part, there are people who think that when you talk about peace in a country like South Sudan, and a lot of African countries, you're really not talking about peace in the sense that people reach a point where they decide that they can begin to respect the lives of their human beings, citizens, and all kind of stuff. But in fact, it's about largely, these are not my words, these are the words of some of these critics, about sharing positions. We're talking about jobs, offices that come with, for example, free telephone. You don't have to worry about whether or not you have time because somebody else is paying. In fact, it's the very ordinary taxpayer who is paying for that. You have an SUV that comes with, it's part of the package. These guys, they don't even care about providing drugs and what have you in hospitals, or even paying their doctors or nurses well so they can treat their people, because when they are sick, they can actually afford to go to Germany, they can afford to come to the United States, they can afford to go to the United Kingdom, they can afford to go to South Africa. And who pays for that kind of service, by the way? The ordinary millions of people in these countries. It's unconscionable, Paul. It's unconscionable. Look, when you think about a country like Sudan, sincerely, it has no business really getting or engaged in fighting. They have more than...
Sudan or South Sudan?
South Sudan. There is more than can go around. I have had the opportunity of overflying that country. It is so fertile to the extent that it would be the breadbasket not only of the region, but beyond. They have oil, the black gold. In fact, I have been looking at pictures how the oil has contaminated and polluted a lot of that area so that you can't even engage in agriculture. They even have very few people. They should be, in fact, in the business of where they should be importing people so that they can come and help them to develop their territory. But guess what? They are even killing the few that they have and scaring some of these people to the extent that almost a third either are living in surrounding countries, about 2 million people. We're talking about Uganda, we're talking about Sudan, Ethiopia, Central African Republic, DRC, and guess what? You also have about 2 million people who are refugees in their own country. They call them,
internally
displaced persons.
Interesting. Let's go to another Facebook comment. Maybe we can tie it into what you're talking about tomorrow. Let's go to Matayo. What's the relevance of both the African Union and the East African Parliament? Obviously, we had a summit, AU summit, taking place in Mauritania over the weekend. Maybe bring us up to speed. What did these leaders talk about, and what are you talking about tomorrow?
Maybe the gentleman is not really talking about the African Union because he also comes up with the East African Parliament, because he's probably talking about the African Parliament and the East African Parliament. Of course, these are institutions that belong to these regional organizations, which are very important. I remember when the African Union was still the Organization of African Unity, I remember asking the then Secretary General, and that was Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim from Tanzania. I was asking him about what is the importance of the Organization of African Unity, really, because a lot of people say that this is simply a talking shop, and that, you know, it is in fact not only a talking shop, but perhaps a talking shop essentially for people who are dictators, who are not people who have been genuinely elected by their own people and all that kind of stuff. They go and just wine and dine. And he said, you know what? The OAU is more than what you think, Shaka. The OAU has helped to decolonize, for example, a lot of African countries from European colonialism and all kind of stuff, which is true. And at the end of the day, the African Union eventually helped to end apartheid in South Africa. And to that extent, these organizations, you know, play a very important role. But I think they pretty much talk the talk. The question is, can they in fact walk that talk so that Africans really can walk the walk? That is the $1 billion question. But otherwise, he also said that, you know what, if in fact the OAU was not there, Africa would probably have had to invent it. Because at the time he said, look at the European Union. It was not made up of many countries, and yet each of them, in fact, if you looked at it, including small Belgium, by the way, at that time, which was about 10 million people, and yet it used to pretty much sit on the shoulders of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Belgium itself was economically very, very rich, much richer than the entire continent of Africa. And yet, guess where it was getting that wealth from? From Africa.
Interesting. Very briefly, talk about what you're talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa.
Tomorrow we are looking actually at the 31st session of the African Union Summit, as you said earlier, which was held in the West African country of Mauritania. And one of the key themes, really, during their summit was combating corruption. So we're going to look at that and some other things that they talked about. The question is, how can you combat corruption, especially if, as it seems to be true in terms of the composition of the African Union, if it is true that you were not really elected by your people. Most of these people, they are where they are because they did a bit of creative accounting. And therefore, they became presidents because the results that made them presidents are not necessarily reflections of the will of their people. So if you can steal an election, how can you have the moral authority, for example, to fight against corruption?
And corruption is all of the above. Do you think this is a visible thing? It's just a rhetoric just to maybe to carry the day? You think they can really actually fight corruption, graft in their government institutions?
Well, first of all, I do not have the competence nor the ability to look into their minds or their hearts to be able to answer that type of question. But you know what? You can only judge people on results, not necessarily on talking the talk. Yes, you can talk the talk. The question is, can you in fact walk that talk and provide some kind of tangible evidence that in fact you have done exactly what you started out doing? And I think there is some evidence, especially when you go to Nigeria and you look at President Buhari.
Shaka, unfortunately, we have to go. Thank you so much. It's been nice hosting you today. I look forward to hosting another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then.